On the morning of the 19th May 1536, people began gathering on Tower Hill before sunrise. Apprentices climbed fences for a clearer view across the scaffold yard. Shopkeepers left stalls unattended along Cheapside and moved east through the waking streets of London. Boats drifted slowly beside the Tower Wharf as passengers watched the fortress walls through river mist. Inside the Tower of London, guards crossed the inner ward, carrying written orders sealed with the king's insignia. A French executioner had arrived from Calais 48 hours earlier. By then, many inside the fortress already understood what that meant. Anne Boleyn waited under guard in royal lodgings near the Bell Tower, the same apartments prepared for high-ranking prisoners and important state guests. Through narrow windows she could hear movement beginning below, servants hauling buckets from the Thames, horses striking against cobblestones, soldiers exchanging watch near the gates. 3 years earlier, she had entered the tower by river before her coronation. Cannons fired from the walls as royal barges approached the landing stairs. Church bells rang across London while crowds pressed against the banks to watch the future Queen of England pass beneath embroidered banners. Now the same fortress prepared for her execution. If you enjoy learning about history, subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. In the comments, let me know where you're listening from. I would love to hear from you. The story you're watching is supported by authentic historical records and academic studies. You can view some of these sources on the screen, and all references are listed in the description for transparency. By 1536, the Tower had become inseparable from Henry VII's government itself. Arrests connected to religion, succession, loyalty, or court politics increasingly ended behind its walls. Noblemen accused of treason arrived by barge through Traitors Gate. Priests suspected of resisting royal policy disappeared into confinement. Wealthy prisoners negotiated for servants, candles, and private rooms, while poorer inmates endured cold chambers blackened by damp river air. Few prisoners experienced torture directly, most never needed to. The fear of interrogation often proved sufficient. Inside the tower, uncertainty shaped daily life more effectively than chains. Prisoners rarely knew who had testified against them or what evidence investigators possessed. A servant carrying food might whisper that pardons were expected. Hours later, carpenters could appear in the yard carrying timber for a scaffold. Everything depended on decisions made elsewhere. The fortress itself dominated eastern London like a military town enclosed within stone walls. At its center stood the White Tower, constructed after the Norman conquest under William the Conqueror. Around it spread workshops, armories, kitchens, stables, guard towers, barracks, storehouses, and official residences connected by narrow passages and enclosed courtyards. The tower never slept entirely. Armorers repaired weapons beside prison chambers. Clerks copied royal correspondence while ravens crossed above the battlements. Kitchens prepared meals for soldiers, servants, and state prisoners simultaneously. Children belonging to tower officials played in courtyards, only yards from men awaiting execution. That mixture of routine and danger unsettled many foreign visitors. Only months earlier, Sir Thomas More had left the tower under armed escort for execution after refusing to recognize Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England. More had served as Lord Chancellor, one of the kingdom's highest offices. Educated, disciplined, respected throughout Europe, he still died as a condemned traitor. His fall changed the atmosphere at court permanently. Men who once believed rank or royal favor could protect them began speaking more cautiously. Courtiers studied reactions before discussing religion or succession openly. Ambitious families continued competing for influence around the king, but they did so with growing awareness that proximity to power carried its own dangers. No prisoner represented that reality more clearly than Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII had reshaped England's political and religious order partly to marry her. His break with Rome fractured the authority of the Catholic Church inside England and redirected enormous wealth toward the crown. Yet by spring 1536, Anne's position had weakened dangerously. She had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and factions within court politics increasingly viewed her as vulnerable. Then the arrests began. On the 2nd of May, Anne was escorted into the Tower under accusation of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. Men associated with her household disappeared into separate chambers across the fortress almost immediately afterward. Among them were Henry Norris, one of the king's closest companions, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Anne's brother George Boleyn, and Mark Smeaton, a court musician. Guards prevented communication between prisoners wherever possible. Servants delivering food were watched closely. Doors remained locked day and night while interrogations continued in different parts of the complex. The Crown intended to control information as carefully as the prisoners themselves. Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuys reported confusion spreading rapidly through London as rumors outran official announcements. Some believed Anne had plotted against the king. Others suspected the accusations had been assembled to remove her politically. Few dared discuss those doubts openly. Inside interrogation rooms, investigators pressed prisoners repeatedly for inconsistencies. Clerks recorded statements onto parchment, while officials compared testimony gathered from different chambers. The process relied less on dramatic confrontation than exhaustion, isolation, and uncertainty about what others might already have confessed. Mark Smeaton occupied the weakest position among the accused. Unlike the noblemen surrounding him, he lacked powerful relatives or political allies capable of intervening on his behalf. His confession to adultery with the Queen soon became central to the Crown's case. Once that confession existed on paper, the direction of events changed rapidly. Trials followed within days. On the 12th of May, Smeaton, Weston, Brereton, and Norris appeared before judges in Westminster Hall. Conviction was widely expected before proceedings even began. 3 days later, Anne and George Boleyn stood trial inside the Tower itself, before nobles assembled under royal authority. Outside the walls, river traffic slowed as boatmen attempted to gather news from soldiers posted along the wharves. People across London sensed something larger than a royal scandal unfolding. If a crowned queen could be destroyed this quickly, then royal favor had become dangerously unstable currency. And inside the Tower, prisoners understood that innocence alone no longer guaranteed survival. The condemned men spent their final days inside separate chambers scattered across the Tower complex. Guards escorted them through different stairwells and enclosed passages whenever movement became necessary. Even brief contact between prisoners risked disrupting the Crown's control over testimony and confession. By mid-May 1536, the fortress had become less a prison than a sealed political theater. George Boleyn occupied rooms within the Beauchamp Tower under heavy guard. Henry Norris, who had once shared private conversations and hunting expeditions with Henry VIII, now faced accusations carrying the penalty of traitor's death. Francis Weston and William Brereton waited nearby while interrogators continued, assembling evidence around them. Only weeks earlier, these men had stood near the center of royal power. Now, servants avoided meeting their eyes. The speed of their collapse disturbed observers across England because it exposed how unstable court life had become under Henry VIII. Advancement depended on royal favor, but favor itself could shift abruptly under pressure from factional rivalry, dynastic anxiety, or suspicions surrounding loyalty to the crown. Inside the Tower, prisoners experienced those shifts with brutal clarity. Interrogations rarely resembled the violent spectacles imagined in later centuries. Officials preferred controlled pressure. Prisoners were questioned repeatedly about dates, meetings, conversations, and private behavior. Investigators compared answers line by line, searching for contradictions. A careless phrase could become evidence. An attempt to protect another prisoner could appear suspicious in itself. The uncertainty exhausted people faster than physical punishment often did. Mark Smeaton's confession altered the atmosphere inside the prison almost immediately. As a musician of comparatively low birth, he lacked the protections surrounding aristocratic prisoners. Whatever pressure investigators applied, his admission gave prosecutors something tangible around which broader accusations could be organized. From that point forward, acquittal became unlikely. The Crown still followed legal procedure carefully. Indictments were drafted. Witnesses appeared before judges. Noble juries delivered verdicts publicly. Henry VIII's government understood the importance of preserving the appearance of lawful process, especially after the political turmoil created by England's break with Rome. Executions alone could create martyrs. Convictions delivered through courts carried greater authority. That distinction mattered deeply to Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Cromwell had spent years expanding royal administration across England through financial oversight, record-keeping, and centralized legal authority. Under his direction, government increasingly operated through documentation. Inventories, confessions, property seizures, tax records, warrants, and examinations copied meticulously by clerks. Men could disappear into that bureaucracy long before executioners appeared. The Tower reflected this transformation perfectly. Armed guards enforced royal authority physically, but paper enforced it administratively. Confessions moved between chambers in the hands of clerks. Reports traveled from interrogation rooms to Cromwell's offices. Officials recorded expenses for prisoners down to the cost of candles, firewood, and chains. Even imprisonment had become systematized. Meanwhile, ordinary life inside the fortress continued with unsettling normality. Kitchens prepared meals beside chambers holding condemned prisoners. Armorers repaired pikes and crossbows for the royal garrison. Ravens crossed above the battlements, while merchants delivered ale and salted meat through the outer gates. Routine continued because the Tudor state depended on routine. For many guards stationed at the Tower, imprisonment was primarily labor rather than ideology. Watches rotated every few hours. Escorts accompanied prisoners to hearings or chapel services. Inventories of confiscated possessions required careful maintenance because valuable property often vanished after arrests. Corruption flourished quietly within that environment. A dishonest official could profit from seized goods, improved accommodations, or special favors granted to wealthy inmates. Prisoners with money secured better food, additional blankets, candles for reading, or permission to receive visitors. Poorer captives endured colder rooms and harsher confinement with little ability to negotiate. The prison revealed Tudor society in concentrated form. Rank shaped survival. Wealth softened punishment. Influence determined how laws were applied. Anne Boleyn herself moved unpredictably between composure and visible strain throughout captivity. Witnesses later described moments when she laughed suddenly before falling silent again. At other times, she prayed for hours or attempted to reconstruct the accusations forming around her. She understood how quickly political isolation had closed around her. Around the king, influential courtiers were already adjusting themselves toward the future. Henry VI's interest in Jane Seymour had become increasingly obvious by spring 1536. Families connected to the Seymours advanced cautiously, while Anne's allies withdrew or fell under suspicion. The court adapted to danger by moving toward whichever direction power appeared to be flowing. On the 15th of May, Anne and her brother George stood trial within the Tower before a gathering of nobles and royal officials. The charges included adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. Contemporary observers noted Anne defended herself intelligently and forcefully, but the verdict had likely been decided before proceedings began. Both were condemned. Outside the fortress, crowds gathered daily along the riverbanks, waiting for news carried outward by servants, guards, and boatmen. London had witnessed political executions before, but this case unsettled people differently. A crowned queen had entered the tower through Traitors Gate, and now the machinery of Tudor government was preparing to destroy her with methodical precision. On the 17th of May 1536, the condemned men were brought from their chambers toward the scaffold at Tower Hill under armed escort. Soldiers carrying halberds cleared narrow passages through the crowd, while officials on horseback controlled movement near the execution site. Thousands gathered outside the walls despite the early hour. Some climbed carts or rooftops for a better view. Others stood silently, waiting to see whether the king's closest former companions would die as traitors. Henry Norris walked beside men he had once dined with inside the royal household. Only months earlier, he had occupied rooms near the king himself. Now he mounted the scaffold under sentence of death. Witnesses recorded that the prisoners spoke cautiously during their final addresses. Tudor executions followed strict expectations. Condemned men were expected to acknowledge royal authority publicly, even when execution resulted from political accusation. Open criticism of the crown could endanger surviving relatives or servants connected to the prisoner. Even at the scaffold, survival calculations continued. George Boleyn's execution drew particular attention because of the charges leveled against him and his sister. Rumors surrounding incest and conspiracy had spread rapidly through London taverns, churches, and marketplaces. Yet uncertainty remained everywhere. Some believed the accusations completely. Others suspected the crown had constructed a legal justification around political necessity. Few voiced those doubts openly. Inside the tower, Anne Boleyn waited while reports from the executions filtered slowly back through servants and guards. Those attending her later described periods of forced composure interrupted by visible anxiety whenever footsteps approached the chamber door. At one point, she repeatedly asked whether the executioner had arrived from Calais. The question mattered because delay could signal negotiation. A postponed execution occasionally meant the crown was reconsidering terms, arranging a confession, or preparing exile instead of death. Prisoners inside the tower learned quickly to search for meaning in timing, movement, and routine. A messenger arriving after midnight might alter everything, so could unexpected silence. But on the morning of the 19th of May, preparations moved forward without interruption. Unlike the men executed publicly on Tower Hill, Anne would die inside the tower itself. Henry VIII wanted the execution controlled carefully, away from the larger London crowd gathering beyond the fortress walls. Shortly after dawn, guards escorted her across the inner ward toward a scaffold raised near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The French swordsman waited beside the platform. Henry had chosen a swordsman rather than the traditional English axe, likely because the method was considered faster and more precise. Observers later recalled Anne appearing calm as she removed her headdress and stepped onto the timber scaffold before assembled officials, guards, servants, and selected witnesses. Her final speech avoided direct criticism of the king. That restraint reflected both political reality and personal calculation. Even moments before death, prisoners understood their words could shape the future treatment of surviving family members and household servants. Anne declared she submitted herself to the law and acknowledged Henry VIII as a merciful ruler. Then she knelt. The execution ended within seconds. By afternoon, workers had already begun dismantling the scaffold, while servants removed traces of the event from the inner ward. Anne's body was placed in an arrow chest and buried inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower grounds. No large public ceremony followed. The government moved quickly because Henry VIII intended to marry Jane Seymour almost immediately. The transition from one queen to the next occurred with startling speed. That speed revealed the deeper function of the Tower under Tudor rule. The fortress did not merely confine enemies of the crown. It processed political change itself. Arrests, interrogations, trials, executions, confiscations, and public declarations all moved through its gates in carefully managed sequence. Over the decades that followed, Catholics, Protestants, nobles, priests, rebels, and royal advisors would all pass through the same prison chambers, depending on which faction controlled power at the time. Some carved names and prayers into the stone walls while awaiting execution or release. Others vanished from the historical record almost entirely. Yet the fear surrounding the Tower remained remarkably consistent. A prisoner entering its gates in 1536 could not rely fully on innocence, rank, wealth, or past loyalty. Too many forces shaped survival. Dynastic fear, religious upheaval, political rivalry, personal ambition, and the unpredictable instincts of a king determined to secure his authority at any cost. The guards still changed watch along the walls. Clerks still copied confessions onto parchment. Barges still crossed the Thames beneath the fortress towers. And somewhere inside those chambers, another prisoner waited for footsteps approaching the door.